Hello, everyone, and welcome to Community Bookstore's virtual event series. My name is Stephanie Valdez, and I'm the co-owner of the bookstore. Tonight, we've partnered with our friends at a public space to welcome Megan Cummins for the release of her new book, If the Body Allows It. She'll be in conversation with Brigid Hughes. While the pandemic has taken a toll on every facet of our lives, virtual programs like the one you're about to see have become a bright spot for our industry during months of quarantine. Thank you to Megan, Brigid, and all of you for your time and attention this evening. And now for some housekeeping. You should be able to see and hear our presenters, but they cannot see or hear you. If you have a question, please click on the Q&A button here at the bottom of the screen to submit it. We'll try to get through as many questions as we can at the end of the program. You'll also find a chat button at the bottom where I'll be posting links to purchase Megan's book, as well as donations link to support our ongoing virtual programming. A caveat for tonight's event, we're all at the mercy of our home internet connections and server loads, so please bear with any technical issues that might arise. We'll try to solve them quickly. Our virtual series continues through the fall, so please head over to our website and set up for our newsletter if you'd like to stay up to date. One that I'll mention, our NYRB Classic series picks up on Thursday with Edwin Frank and Madeline Schwartz discussing Anna Seeger's classic novel, Transit. So now a bit about tonight, our author tonight, and we'll get started. Megan Cummins is a writer and the managing editor of A Public Space. Her debut story collection, If the Body Allows It, was awarded the 2019 Prairie Schooner Book Prize in Fiction. Her work has appeared in A Public Space, Guernica, One Teen Story, Ninth Letter, and elsewhere. She's working on a YA novel set in Michigan and South Dakota. She lives in New York City. Brigid Hughes is the editor of the literary and arts magazine A Public Space and A Public Space Books. She teaches in the MFA program at Columbia University and lives in New York City. And A Public Space is an independent, nonprofit publisher of an eponymous award-winning literary arts and culture magazine and A Public Space Books. Under the direction of founding editor Brigid Hughes since 2006, it has been their mission to seek out overlooked and unclassifiable work and to publish writing from beyond established confines. And now I will turn it over to our guests.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, and thank you to Ezra and Hal and everyone at Community Bookstore for hosting this event tonight. I am so glad to be here. And to have a chance to hear Megan read and to talk with her about these stories. But before we do, I just want to take a moment to ask everyone out there, even though we can't see you, to join me in raising a virtual toast to Megan and to this beautiful book, and to imagine the sound of a champagne cork popping and a room full of cheers. Which is what we had hoped to be doing tonight. This is an event that we have looked forward to since the news that this collection had won the Prairie Schooner Prize. And even further back since Megan's first story appeared in A Public Space. And we had the sense that this was a really special writer with great things to come. She has, for the past many years, supported and championed so many writers through her work at A Public Space. And so it's really, just so special to be able to celebrate her and her writing tonight. So thank you, Megan, for your writing for this book and for this event tonight. And I think we thought we would start off by having Megan read a little bit from the stories.
Sounds great. Thank you so much. And cheers to everyone. Thank you so much for being here. It's so wonderful to see so many of you. And I hope you'll post in the chat. It makes us feel like we're all together in the same space and post questions in the Q&A. Thank you again. So I'm going to read from two pieces in the book. The one is a very short piece, the very first piece in the book that sets up the frame for the book. There's a recurring character throughout the book, and the rest of the stories in the book are presented as having been written by this character, Marie. And then I'll read a little bit from the second story as well. So the first story is called Heart. The doctor looks at me and says, no fuss, no apology, that someone like me should never be pregnant. This medication, that complication, they keep on doing card tricks with your life, even when you're doing better. I can't decide whether to be relieved or devastated. What's gone is not only the chance to have a baby, but the chance to decide whether or not I want a baby. So I say to the doctor, that's interesting. Afterward, the room is silent except for the crinkling of the exam table paper and the bubbling of the keyboard as the doctor finishes her notes. I make my next appointment on my way out. Marie, M-A-R-I-E, I spell for the receptionist when she doesn't hear me. I sit alone in my car and glide through New Jersey toward the Newark brownstone where I live. I think of the time I lied and told the cashier at Meijer that I had a daughter. This was in Ann Arbor during college years ago. The years since seemed to have come and gone without even taking off their coats. The cashier asked me if I had a sick kid at home when the 10 bottles of Pedialyte I was buying wobbled down the conveyor belt, fluorescent against the night outside, little lies themselves. I said yes, and the cashier, I remember her hair was the color of the inside of an almond, asked how old, and I said 11. The lie emerged from my mouth sure of itself, but it was a ridiculous lie, the type of lie that would capsize you, the type of lie that makes people believe they know everything about you. I was only 21 then, after all. I was buying the Pedialyte for Octavia, who was my roommate, not my child, and her colon was full of bleeding ulcers. The Meijer was familiar to us. We'd been shopping there for years, but now Octavia was bedridden, and in many ways I'd gotten used to doing everything with her, so it felt strange to wander the bright, empty aisles alone. Only 1 month earlier, we decided, she and I, that it would be wise to go grocery shopping in a blizzard. This was before she got sick, before I got sick, before her father died, and before mine did too, before we both left Michigan and lost each other in the world, and back when writing was easier because I didn't have anything to write about. Maybe the blizzard was telling us, stay home, girls, and let the world do its worst, but not yet to you. Instead, we flew through the aisles, staticky with excitement because we loved this kind of daily danger back then and beckoned it. By the time we were outside, the wind was busy rearranging the world. The wheels of the cart tried to trample the snowdrifts, those piles of uncarved marble looking bright and starved on the asphalt. She pulled the cart and I pushed. Our laughter was crinkle cut and captured by the wind, carried to the stars, which I seem to recall shining brightly, which is impossible, but still that's how I remember it. The constellations looking down on us through the white silk of the storm as though we were their only constituents, the two of us and our plastic bags that flapped in the wind like wild beating hearts. Then we drove home on the icy roads and we were completely fine. As I angle my car into its spot in Newark, a light precipitation falls, somewhere between snow and rain. I kill the engine and sit in the car, which ticks as it cools, surrounded by the quiet midday street. Ralph, my boyfriend, is gone for the day, and when he gets home, we'll pick up where we left off in our daily arguing. I should get on the train and go to work for the afternoon like I said I would, but I might call in. I want to call Octavia, but she and I lost touch years ago. I've heard she's better. I've heard she has a baby. I'll probably cry in the shower later. There's nothing wrong with crying in the shower sometimes, even when you're in your 30s, especially when you're in your 30s. Back then, I'd been embarrassed by the lie. Now I think that it might have felt good to shock someone, to have, if only briefly, a secret life. The cashier had stared at me when I said the made-up age, 11, and the look in her eyes said she could do nothing for me but tell me how much I owed. That was the first story, and the next story is called The Beast, and I'm just going to skip part of the beginning just to give you the best parts. But all you need to know is it's about a woman named Beverly who lives in Nebraska with her husband, and she works for an insurance company for this man named Cal, and the relationship is sort of dysfunctional. And one morning in the paper, she sees that her old prom date is sort of semi-famous in a metal band, and he's coming to her town. And the band is called Beastific. It's a pun on the word beatific, and it's with the word beast, but she doesn't know if it's pronounced beastific or beastific, and that sort of causes her anxiety. So I'm going to start just a little ways into the middle. I worked at an insurance brokerage firm as something called a marketing specialist, but I mostly answered phones and forwarded emails and acted as a personal assistant and sometimes partner in crime to my boss, Cal Nevins. Once, without discomfort, Cal handed me a pair of women's glasses and a disc of birth control pills along with an address written on a scrap of paper. I wrapped the glasses in paper towels from the bathroom and slipped everything into a manila envelope, sticking a generic return label to its corner. I thought about adding a note warning the woman that she could get pregnant on the pill if she chronically missed days, but no one needs a stranger to patronize her. I commuted 40 minutes from New Plains to Omaha each day to do things like this, but taking care of Cal's twin daughters, Caroline and Maggie, I liked the best. They could be spoiled, grumbling girls, but they were sweethearts more than anything. I found them both sitting in my desk chair when I arrived at work on Monday morning. The office was empty except for them. They'd taken ice cream from the freezer and were sucking chocolate off of flimsy plastic spoons. The lights were off and cartoons playing on my computer blew moonlight over the girls' faces. Dad told us to wait for you here, Bevy. Caroline looked up at me. Is that so? I leaned over them and nudged down the volume on the computer. Are these cartoons pirated? No, Maggie giggled. You don't have to pirate anymore, Bev, you stream. Let's go, I frowned. I'll take you girls to school. I finished a homework assignment Caroline hadn't done when I returned to the office, which was now alive with ringing phones and the rushing sound of the copier. The lights were on in Cal's office, but the blinds were drawn and the door closed. Caroline's smile, reflected in the rearview mirror, had harpooned me. I felt elated from having spent a little time with her and Maggie. Sometimes I wondered what I wouldn't do for those girls. The assignment was to illustrate bookmarks with depictions from The Trumpet of the Swan. I wasn't a good artist, and my thoughts wandered from the girls to Hadrian. The night before had brought a burgeoning fantasy of the two of us together and young. I'd imagined we'd done things we hadn't, normal things like driving around in his car or eating at a restaurant. As quickly as the fantasy brought joy, it brought unhappiness, a reminder I was no longer very young. Our old selves, or what used to be our old selves, filled me with sadness, the striking type of sadness that demands to be remedied some way, somehow, and immediately. I put Caroline's bookmarks aside and clicked through the internet until I had 2 tickets to the Beastific show in my basket. Luckily, they were cheap. My credit card was nearly maxed out. I paid for the tickets before I could change my mind. I bought 2 tickets because one seemed desperate. I didn't want to take Robert with me, but who else was there? The show was the next day, a Tuesday night in New Plains, when everything was so dead we sometimes wondered if the sun would overlook us in the morning. The phone rang. I answered. How did you get this number? I said. Stop harassing me. The caller was a man this time, from the same supposed collection agency that had been trying to scam me, and he recited with confidence my full name and social security number. He gave the balance on the credit card, an astronomical amount I wasn't sure I'd heard correctly. I've told you that I know this is a scam. If you were a real collection agency, you would have sent me something in the mail. But we have several times. I listened to his breathing as he waited for me to respond. Then I hung up. I pulled up the number for Amex's customer service and was ready to call them, to complain, to ease my worries, when Cal emerged from his office wearing a white shirt with thin, silky pinstripes running up and down the fabric. His always bleary eyes made him look some combination of tired and high. Sometimes I thought he was the wrong sort of person to have money. Other times I believed it was the money that had made him the way he was. I often felt protective of him, or maybe I was only protective of myself. I helped him with so many of the things he did wrong. Beautiful, he said, picking up a bookmark. You made it look like a child drew these. I wanted to ask him for gas money for this morning and for the trip I would be making later to drop off the bookmarks. The girls went to a private school 30 minutes away, but I felt too ashamed. Asking for money reminded me I had no real claim to their love. But Cal would pay anything to show his daughters he loved them, especially after he and his wife had dragged each other through that nasty divorce. I sent the girls presents to her house using Cal's credit card. I made their lunches the next day in the office kitchen before I left on the afternoons Cal had the girls. I spread mayonnaise on turkey sandwiches, peeled carrots, and filled tiny containers with ranch dressing, tied neat baggies of chocolate with ribbon. Other people would quit, or at least find the work demeaning. I hadn't gotten a promotion in the nearly 5 years I'd worked for Cal, and I could be making more money somewhere else. Money Robert and I could put toward a down payment. But this job made me comfortable, as though I'd found a knot of people who understood and appreciated me. Their dilemmas were mine to solve, and I solved them better than I did my own. So in this next scene, she finds out that it's her husband who actually has opened a credit card and has been making sort of an astronomical number of charges in her name. And I'll skip ahead to when she's getting ready to go to the show to reunite with Hadrian. I was glad to find Cal full of anxious energy the next day at work. I needed a distraction. The morning brought a problem with one of the clients, a parking service called Safely Park. Cal had brokered the policy, but now the carrier had canceled the general liability insurance because when the policy was initially signed, Cal had forged the loss runs to make it appear as though Safely Park had never had an accident or filed a claim. But Safely Park crashed cars all the time. Cal was furious when the notice of cancellation was faxed over. He snapped at the sales staff and the customer service reps. The general liability specialist emerged from Cal's office with her head hung. I caught her blotting tears in the kitchen. Somehow this was everyone's fault but Cal's and mine, though I'd used Photoshop to make the loss runs look clean. I'll end up in the slammer right next to Cal, I joked back then, but I grew nervous as the day went on. What if the carrier reported the fraudulent loss runs to the Department of Insurance? What if I did go to jail? Cal was on the phone all afternoon, calling in favors, saying he didn't know how the mistake had happened. Finally, he slapped the phone into its cradle, which I heard from my desk outside of his office. I turned to see him take his bottle of Grey Goose from his desk and call out, "All clear, get out of here, you scoundrels." Everyone in the office clapped. I did too. We hated Cal when he yelled, and we loved him when he let us leave at 3 p.m., even if we'd almost gotten in trouble earlier that day. I lingered, and when everyone except Cal had left, I checked my credit rating. There was the American Express card, the balance glowering at me, and beneath it a visa I didn't recognize. I began weeping. I'd gotten pregnant on prom night, the night I'd spent with Hadrian. I had stayed pregnant for 12 weeks until I returned 18 and didn't need my parents' permission. Getting rid of the baby then had been the right choice, but now having a baby might never be an option. I wondered if I could sue Robert or put him in jail. But the truth was, I was either bound to Robert, bound to the debt, or free of it, but on my own. I put my head in my hands. "Beverly, are you okay?" Cal had come out of his office. I swiped tears from my eyes and slowly gathered my things. Cal stood in his doorway, clutching the bottle of Grey Goose by his side. I avoided his eyes as I slipped my arms into my jacket. "Oh yeah, yep, just worried about today. I didn't mean to do anything wrong." "You didn't do anything wrong." "Everything's really okay?" I asked. "Oh, Bevy," he said, "I would never throw you under the bus. If the DOI came for you, they'd have to go through me first." "Okay," I said. What a day. He swung the bottle of vodka to his mouth. "I need to go get a drink." I looked at him closely and saw tears brimming in his eyes. "I'm going to a concert tonight." I didn't know why I was telling him, but I knew I did not want to see him cry. I hadn't told Robert about the show, and as I spoke, I knew I wasn't going to. "What band?" "Someone's I knew a long time ago. I don't think the music will be very good." "It sounds fun." "Well, I have an extra ticket. It's all the way in New Plains, though." Sunlight pierced the window behind Cal's head. He appeared to be thinking. We didn't want each other. If we did, something would have happened by now. We just wanted to be a little less lonely. We wanted something different from what we had. Cal and I ate dinner at the hotel bar, Cal guzzling vodka sodas, and then I drove us to the venue, a barn just outside of New Plains. I parked in a roped-off grass lot that spread away from the barn. Clusters of wild violets sprouted in the fields surrounding. Teenagers in heavy black boots stomped over them. Cal had fallen asleep on the way, and I sat in the car with the engine clicking, embarrassed that I'd cried, and surprised that I'd felt so strongly that I'd lost someone upon seeing my ruined credit, the rating persistently read on the screen. In a life of blind, vague longings, I'd seen clearly something I wanted, only to have it taken away. I nudged Cal awake. "Ready, or would you rather stay here?" "Ready." The barn teemed with teenagers wearing black. They'd painted their faces to look like skulls, and some wore devil's horns like I'd seen Hadrian wearing in the paper. I trudged in my pumps and nylons toward the door. Cal trailed behind, looking a little ill. The last of the sun fell on a boy selling t-shirts adorned with the band name. The T in beatific was an upside-down Gothic cross. "These kids look pretty fucked up," Cal said. He pointed to a group of girls staring foolishly from within the hoods of their sweatshirts, their eyes rimmed with heavy black eyeliner. I mean, what parents would let their kids dress like this? I thought of Cal's girls and wondered what their futures would bring. Now they wore matching sapphire rings, Christmas gifts from Cal. What would they trade those rings for when the time came? "They probably think we're parents who wouldn't let our kids go alone," I said. "They're probably wondering who here is the loser who came with mom and dad." I warmed then at the thought that one of those kids could be my own. I noticed a few women parked in cars, piles of coats in the back seats. "I'm going to find the bar," Cal said. One long note resounded from inside the barn. The show had begun. I stood in the back and watched Hadrian sing into a microphone swinging from the ceiling. His face was the same face, strong chin and sunken eyes, high cheekbones. He was wearing his hair long again. He looked boyish. I became once again the girl who wanted him, the girl who had teased him out of love. But standing there, I also felt the presence of all the time we'd been apart. We never known each other then. We never known each other in the first place. I'd had nothing to do with his angst. And now I was not the wicked bitch he sang about. Oh, I'm going to leave Beverly there and we'll return to her later.
So I'll just say, to repeat what Stephanie said, that there's a question section here, and I hope everyone, as they have questions, will enter them. But I am going to take advantage of this opportunity to ask a few of my own. I wanted to start by asking you to talk a little bit about the structure of the book. There are a couple of sort of inspired, inventive decisions that you made. One of them has to do with sort of this character of Marie, and sort of her stories interweave throughout the book. And she is a writer, and we are led to believe that the other stories in the book are stories that she has written. So in a sense, we have the personal essay and the fiction. And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about how you came to that decision and sort of how it informed the book.
Absolutely, yeah. So not to go too far back, but you know, I left grad school in 2015 and I'd have written some stories. The Beast was one that I had written there, or started there, but I didn't have a book, and that was okay. But I didn't sort of leave with a manuscript. And that summer I went to the Bear River Writers Conference, and there Laura Kaziski, a former teacher of mine and wonderful author and poet, gave us a prompt, and that was how I wrote the first story in the book that I read for you. And I knew that I wanted to return to that character, and I kept thinking about her, and I wrote a few more stories with her as the narrator. And then I realized that many of the other stories that were in which she was not a character were all sort of chronically exploring what I came to understand as the details of her life, but within fiction. And so that was how I started to see the book as a book, and the stories I'd been working on for years as a book. And on a different sort of meta layer, you know, I think for me, it's, you know, from, you know, an essay I published and an interview, it's sort of no secret that some of those themes are also relevant to my own life. And so I was interested in what I could learn about myself and about my writing from exploring sort of nonfiction and exploring my life through fiction, and also how I could remove that even further by then giving over the most nonfiction, the most essayistic parts of my life to this character Marie, but then fictionalizing those as well. And so I was interested in those layers of removal.
One of the things I loved about it was that it sort of did the opposite of what many fiction writers do when they're asked how much of this is true. And I felt like you sort of embraced that question and organized the book in a way that the reader sort of got to think through that. And that first story that you read, Heart, which is the opening of the book, has this great phrase in it that was sort of what I had in my mind as I read through the whole book. You say, when you're talking about the lie that she tells, and she says, it was the type of lie that would make people believe they knew everything about you. And I thought just the way that the story, the collection interwove back and forth between Marie and her fictionalized versions of her life were a way of exploring those questions. The other sort of central organizing principle is the idea of the body. And it's there in the title. And then the stories in the collection are grouped into 6 sections: heart, eyes, lungs, blood, skin, skeleton. And I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about at what point you brought that into the collection.
Yeah, so the body was something I knew the book, I knew that I wanted to explore with the book, and I wanted to do it overtly. I think for a long time, I realized that bodies were failing in the stories I was writing in many different ways. And as I put the book together, I realized there was sort of a certain redundancy in that in that, you know, many of the stories do sort of tread those similar ideas about illness and addiction, and mental health. And I decided, rather than trying to make the stories more, or find ways to make the stories more different, that I would bring them together really tightly. And in a way, I wanted that to sort of mimic the feeling of chronic illness by making it, well, in a way, I mean, chronic illness is often invisible to the outsider, but I wanted to sort of let the reader feel that chronic presence of the body. You know, I think we often think about, you know, mind over matter and things like that, but it's with the title of the book and with the stories, I wanted to express and show the limitations that the body puts on, that can put on every aspect of your life. And no matter how sort of resilient or how determined you are, there's a certain point where, you know, mind does not triumph over matter. And so by putting the stories within that frame and naming them parts of the body, I wanted to get across that kind of constriction. And then also express that the chronic illness that the narrator has, lupus, is it's a disease that affects every system of the body. And so, well, I don't think I got quite every system into the book. It would have been a little too long. You know, I think I hit the bases there. And then there are also some of them more overtly than others, but the system of the body that's titles each section, I found sort of thematic connections there. You know, whether it's heart or the lungs or skeleton.
So how did you have all the stories written when you thought about that way of organizing them?
I did, yeah. So I had the stories divided into 6 sections, and I went back and forth. At first I had them titled with, or I had the frame of the book the stories didn't have titles. I just called them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And but that it felt, just even looking visually at the table of contents, that felt, I felt the absence there. I felt that there was something that was needed that wasn't there. And so all of the stories had titles in the past, just when I had written them as, I mean, they were linked, but as I was writing them individually. But those didn't quite work either. And, you know, a couple of the stories are published in journals under those former titles. Heart, that I read, was published in Okey Panky as Wild Beating Hearts. The last story in the book, which is called Skeleton, was published in Joyland as Q&A. And then so it took a lot of thinking and a lot of sort of trial and error when I realized that the body was the thing linking the whole book. And so that was going to be the thing that linked the frame as well.
We have a couple of questions in here that I will relay. Do you find that you give life to your characters, or do your characters come to life and tell you their stories?
Oh, wow, that's a great question. I think probably more so the latter, I would hope. I mean, that's sort of what I like to think anyway. I mean, certainly it's a mix, but I think with a lot of the stories, even the story, you know, the stories with Marie, who in some ways, her biography tracks parallel to mine, if not exactly. The things that made me most interested about her were the things that were different, you know, were more different for me. I think she's a little more, you know, stubborn than I am. I think she's more self-destructive than I am. I think she's much more, she's much more lost than I am. And so all of those things interested me about her. And so when I sort of imagine a character, I think I usually start with just sort of like a snippet about their lives or something that they might say. And it's, you know, I find that I'm a much better dialoguist in writing than I am in person. You know, I trip over my word. You know, I'm not as confident as of a speaker as my characters are. So sometimes, so I think it's the things that are different about them that I wouldn't necessarily imagine myself doing and sort of like breathing life into, that makes me want to keep writing about them.
We have a question about autobiography in these stories from Kyle Williams, who did a fabulous interview with you in Full Stop that I would, if you haven't seen it, I would encourage everyone to check it out. He says, I'm thinking about Betty Howland's notion of truth versus imagination. Could you speak to how you navigate between those aspects of using aspects from your own life?
Yes. Am I remembering right, Brigid, that the quote is, everyone's asking not how much invention there is, but the real question is imagination, how much imagination there is. Yes, that is so interesting. I mean, I absolutely agree with Betty there. I think it's interesting. You know, I don't, when I'm writing a story, or when I'm writing just in general, I think I only really get caught up in thinking about what we might call invention when I'm thinking about plot, because that is when I'm thinking, and my stories aren't too awfully, I mean, some of them are, but plot might not be what I'm thinking about first and foremost, but that's when I sort of get into like, oh, and then this could happen and this could happen, and it sort of seems like it's building, sort of spinning a wheel in that way, or cranking a handle. And I sort of equate that with invention, but the imagination of it to me is filling out the interiority of the characters' lives. And in this book and in my writing in general, interiority is really important. You know, I love writing scenes, but all of my scenes are filled with sort of ruminatory asides by whoever the narrator is, or whoever owns a point of view in the story. Because to me, what happens isn't like a scene happening. It's not interesting to me if I don't know what the characters are feeling and thinking about it. And maybe that's because, you know, I live very much inside my head a lot of the time, and I'm always sort of analyzing, you know, and it's definitely not always a good thing. You know, I'm always sort of overthinking. And so that's just kind of my nature, to want to know what the characters would be thinking about it. So I often sort of tread off into interior lives, and that's sort of, well, I guess what's more interior than the imagination of a character. So I like thinking about not just my imagination as a writer, but what would the imagination of the character be?
Yeah. You talked about interiority and about writing dialogue. I'm curious about writing scene, because I think you have some sort of just extraordinary descriptions that give me such a vivid image of the setting. I'm thinking when we published we are holding our own, which was, I don't know how many years ago at this point, and there's a description of a woman's red skirt sort of fluttering as she got into a car, and for me that I knew sort of, I felt I knew everything about the character from that, the way you had described the skirt.
Yeah, that's I think I look I sometimes have a hard time picturing sort of like the bigger space of a scene, you know, even if it's just like a room, you know, a room or a house. I have to imagine it by like zooming in really close to a detail. And that's a way that I position myself as the writer. And sometimes that is kind of a tell that I need to like go back and edit, that it's, you know, I'm there too much as a writer. But it's a way that I give myself a little bit of forward momentum in a story if I'm trying to find some connective tissue between what's being said or what's being thought. I try to, I guess it would be zooming out a little bit, actually, like in a big macro sense of scene, it's zooming in, but when you're thinking about zooming out of a character's head, I zoom out a little bit and see like what relevant detail could be there, or what's something this character might notice. I know I one of my first workshops at Rutgers, Newark, was with Alice Elliott Dark. I think she might be here tonight. Hi, Alice. But she had said she really liked my similes, but she was like, you have to rein it in. And I was thinking about it, and I realized that I was using just the writing of similes as a way to like keep going and drafting, just as a way to move forward with language. And I think and hope that I've learned to, you know, to use that when it's working and cut it when it's not. So
That's great. I didn't know that was how you thought about metaphor. Let's see. I love your commentary about the limitations of the body, and wonder if you could talk about the limitations of language, if you think there are any, and how they parallel or conflict.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I think, well, there are definite limitations in how we talk about illness, I think, and especially how we talk about, and even more maybe how we talk about addiction. And so I think even while I was writing this book, I ran into those limitations because, you know, my understanding of my own chronic illness is, you know, very medical. And, you know, my understanding of addiction is from, you know, the point of view of sort of a child. And so, I mean, it's grown beyond that, but I think that was one of sort of the discovery processes I wanted to go through with the book, was see how this character could come to better understand the links between the two, and better understand how to even just think about them and think about how she can talk about them. Because one of the big points of conflict with Marie is that she doesn't tell the man she starts seeing that she's sick, and because she doesn't know. I mean, they talk about everything. They talk about the things they have in common, and one of those things is addiction, with friends and family, but she doesn't know how to talk about the illness part of her life. And so, yeah, I think that definitely those intersect just in life in general, and they intersect in the book and sort of those plot points. And I'm sure, looking back, I certainly ran into like, how do I write this in a way that doesn't, to me, feel like cheesy, or to me doesn't feel like, you know, there's a lot of stock language about both, you know, illness and addiction, and even the fact that I'm speaking of them separately. You know, I mean, addiction is an illness, so the fact that I'm using two different words for them is telling of that. You know, that there is sort of this stock language and the stock way of thinking about it. So, you know, it would be interesting to go back and look at the book with, and really sort of scrape and you know, look at the language and the ways that I, as the writer, talk about those two things in the book. But I certainly think there's a connection, and certainly struggled with it too while writing.
One more question about bodies. We're coming in fast and furious, the questions. I'm struck by your saying that bodies were failing was your through line for the story collection. This phrase, of course, brings to mind the question of what succeeding would be. Are there other story collections about bodies failing or succeeding that have drawn you in or served as models?
Oh, yes. That's a great question. And that it's such a good question to think about, what would succeeding mean? Because everybody has their, nobody's perfect. And I don't know what, I think I can imagine what succeeding would look like, sort of in a mainstream sense of like, and I think that something that people with chronic illness run into is that we look like we have successful bodies, in that sort of whatever that an outside viewer might make, what that might mean to them, the idea of a successful body. And so then there comes in the idea of like skepticism, and the idea of it's all in your head, and the idea of that it's you don't look sick is the refrain that people have sort of started to call out more and more. And so I think part of the conflict there is that, with the idea of the bodies failing in the book, there really is no successful body, but everyone's going to project that onto someone who looks healthy. And as far as how other books that were influential on me, for me, well, Sarah Micah's book, Cities I've Never Lived In, just in general, that book was very influential on me in the writing of the book, especially with the way she links stories. And in terms of illness narratives, Laura Kaczynski's book of poems, Space in Chains, deals with illness in some ways. That I returned to that poetry collection, I think, again and again when I was reading this. And it's, there's a poem in it where she describes the end of the life as the end of someone's life as the spoon slipping quietly into the beautiful soup. And something about that image stuck with me, even today. And as I was writing about like something so calm and so serene, but that represents the end of a life. And I think that just made me think it's just in a different way about how we think about life, death, and bodies and illness. I'm not sure that answered the question completely, but there are definitely more books, but it's one of those things where when someone asks you what book you've read, you are like, I've never read a book in my life. What are you talking about? I'm kidding.
Robert Sullivan is wondering if you can comment about the great line that ends, "Back when writing was easier because I didn't have anything to write about." And on a side note, would like to know, how much research have you done on metal bands in barn settings?
That's a great question. I love Robert Sullivan fact checking here with the metal band. So I'll start with that because it might be a bit of a construct, but the part I didn't read from in the beginning of that story is that this band, Beastific, is doing what they call a rural terror tour. And so they're playing like far out in the country, kind of off the beaten tracks. It's sort of like a trendy thing they're doing. Whether a true metal band, a true metal band member would whether that would pass muster with them, that idea, I don't know. I might be that might be a bit of a stretch, but if there are any, I would go see a metal band playing in a barn. I think that would be pretty cool. But
can I ask a related question?
Sure, yeah.
Somebody had Laura Spence Ash is wondering about your sense of humor in the stories, which is such a part of your writing. And she's wondering, does this come easily to you as you write, or is it something you tease out in revision?
Yeah, thank you, Laura. I'm so glad you're here. And yes, I mean, I think it. I was talking to my friend Maria Kuznetsova, who's a fabulous writer. She and I went to UC Davis together, and she and I were talking about humor in the book. And her book, Ixana Behave, is really hilarious too. And we sort of, as we were talking, we realized, that you can't escape humor even when you want to. So I think a lot of the humor in my book is really kind of, it's like knee jerk a lot. And so it's always funny to me. I think it's not always funny to everyone else, but that any humor I think usually comes in, not necessarily in the first draft, but it's something that happens somewhat organically, which I suppose humor should, or maybe it's good for me anyway when it does. If I try to sit there and think, like I've tried with drafting, feel like, how can I make this a little bit funnier? And it never works. It's always awkward. So yeah, it doesn't really, I've tried to finesse it out in revision before, and I've always ended up cutting those bits. Yeah.
And on a related note, Megha Majumdar says she'd love to hear a piece of craft storytelling advice for all the writers in the room. Is there something that's occupying you right now? Something that occupied you while you were writing these stories?
Yeah, something that occupied me while writing these stories, I think, was that I knew, because a lot of the themes were repeated, and because, there was a character who in some ways, is related to my own story. I had to find a balance between being rigorous, like a rigorous reviser of myself, but then also not holding back. I think it's sometimes and even some of the last minute revisions I did on the book, I sort of thought, oh, I like pulled back a little bit there and I don't know why, so it's a balance. And so I maybe the easiest way of saying that is to trust your vision, but also look at it again, which is what, revision means. And then a couple of the stories in the book are from the points of view of teenagers. And I never, and the novel I'm writing now is, I don't know, I've been calling it YA. I don't know if it's YA or not, but I think that's part of the thing that is making it work for me and that made writing teenagers in the book work for me, is that I never asked myself, like, is this what a teenager would really think, which, maybe another writer would have, but I let the character think as a character rather than thinking as a teenager. And that has opened, I think that made me feel like I could create a real person rather than creating a sort of stock teenager. So if anyone's writing about teenagers, I would advise, it worked for me anyway, or works better for me. If you think of them as a person and not think of them as a teenager, which is all what teenagers really want anyway, right? To be not thought of as teenagers. So,
could you talk a little bit about non-literary influences on your work, music, film? And this reader is asking, what music should they listen to while they read this book?
Oh, I love that question. So I think a big influence for me for music is Jenny Lewis, who is probably my favorite artist, and her band before she had her solo career is called Rilo Kiley. And I listen to, I don't listen to music when I write because I can't concentrate if I do, but I listen to music when I sort of think about drafting or make notes. And I think I listened to a lot of Rilo Kiley, and for some sort of nostalgia reason, I went back and listened to their first album from like 2001, maybe 2002. I don't remember exactly, but so I would suggest listening to Jenny Lewis. Her new album's really good. It's called On the Line. And movies, absolutely. I mean, I think my, oh gosh, one of my favorite movies, which one? Well, which movies was I watching? That's a good question. I don't know that any movies really influenced this, but definitely Jenny Lewis.
That's a good one.
Yeah.
I think we have time for a couple more questions. And I'll see if we can get to all of them. There's a question, Sarah Blakely Cartwright is wondering about the last story. She says it's one of her favorites and offers a leap in point of view. Can you talk about your approach to endings in the collection?
Yes, sorry, which I cut out for a second. Which story was it?
The last story.
The last story. Oh, yes. Yeah, so that I love flash forwards. And thank you, Sarah, for that question. So I knew I had written that story earlier, and I knew it was part of sort of this linked part of the frame with the character. And I was interested in the idea that this character had spent this whole, in theory, all these pages sort of exploring these ideas and exploring herself. And then with the second to last story, Higher Power, I very intentionally placed that one where I did, because it's from the point of view of a father who goes to see his daughter when she's sick, and he's a recovering addict. He's been clean a long time. And that was Marie sort of giving her father that story, the chance to tell that story as it's almost like his story if he'd lived. And so, and his life's not perfect, but he's treated by Marie as human rather than as this sort of like myth. She, I think, thinks about addiction very mythologically for a good, part of the book. And so I liked having that as the penultimate story, and then sort of going to her at this somewhat awkward book launch where she may have found out how to write about all these things, but she still in a way hasn't found out how to speak about them. She sort of goes off on this long rambling story about her friend Octavia, who's in that first story, and doesn't really pop in again until that last story. And her friend Amina's in the audience, sort of like shaking her head. And I thought it was funny. I thought, but it wasn't just humor, why I ended it there. I thought it was interesting to see that this is still going to be a process for her. If she thinks of that personally, that second to last story as a breakthrough, it's not necessarily that the story's over, and that's okay though. It's not, it's not the point for it to be over, but it's, she still is who she is even after writing this book.
Can you talk a little bit about Octavia, as she's the friend who's in the first story, and as you said at the end, and memories of two conversations with her are sort of the frame of the book. And I'm curious.
Yeah.
She's then fictionalized in one of Marie's stories.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I mean, Octavia's been in the book for a long time. So the oldest story in the book is Counter Girls, which is the one in which Octavia is fictionalized as Maylee. And that story I wrote in 2010 when I was a student at UC Davis. And it's changed actually very little since then. And the character really stuck with me. And I knew that, and so then when I was thinking about putting the book together, I went through this period with an earlier iteration of the book where I was like, where can I draw connections everywhere? It was sort of a disaster. I was like, well, this story is linked to this one, and before I sort of settled on the frame. But I knew that Maylee was Octavia. And I think, she is such a strong force for Marie. They were very connected in college, and much of Marie's identity was formed through her relationships with Octavia in college. And you can sort of see that in Counter Girls, where the two characters are fictionalized. And so then to have her return at the end is a bit of catharsis for Marie, but also a bit of, a little bit of a rewind too. It sort of brings up these things like right before her book launch, where she kind of is brought back into this past that they had. But ultimately the reconnection is good. And Marie doesn't have, Marie doesn't have many, relationships, so this one, even though it's in the past, it's, she doesn't have all that many people in her life. So it was important that she have that character, I think. So.
No, I shouldn't say, it's fascinating that you started with a fictional character and then went to Octavia.
Yeah.
The lies. Maybe we will end with where this story collection began at UC Davis, with a question from Ian Lee, who's one of your professors there, I believe. She says, I'd love to hear you talk about landscape, Michigan especially, which I learned so much about from your earlier stories. You talk about the limitations of bodies and language. What do you think about the limitation of a physical landscape compared to an interior landscape?
Oh yeah, thank you, Yoon. It's great to see you here. And yeah, you've read a couple of these stories in the earliest forms at Davis. So I think place is really important to the book, and it's I think the place is conflict for the characters in a lot of ways, even if they feel at home there. So for Marie, for example, one of the things that gives her the most comfort in her life is that she loves living in Newark, but at the end the body wins out over that. She has to move because she can't get the right health insurance plan on the marketplace. And I think in other stories, the places are not always what the characters find them to be. They might want the place to be how it used to be, or they want it to be how it never was, or I think the characters in the book conflate the places they are with other things going on in their lives, and they project onto them. And I was interested in thinking about how, like a physical space is a bit of a canvas for characters to, even if they live there happily, there's always sort of this potential that either the place will change, or that they will have to leave, or that they won't, or someone else will have to leave and the place won't feel the same anymore. And of the places that I write about, I always knew where I was going to set the stories. I never came up with a sort of idea for a story without immediately knowing where it was going to be set. So I think something on a subconscious level, like I knew that those characters lived there already. And that, I think, for me as a writer, like, luckily made me feel sort of in that place automatically. And they also, it helps that they're, with the exception of Nebraska, all the stories in the book are places where I've lived as well. So.
Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone for joining us. Thank you to Community Bookstore for hosting this event. I shall now turn it back over to Stephanie.
I'm back just to say thank you for this. It's always so interesting for us, because every night, even though we have different people, it still has the sort of magic and the serendipity of the particular conversation and the particular work. Thanks for talking in such detail about your process and your ideas, Megan. And thank you for the wonderful questions, Brigid, as we would imagine they would. And from the audience too.
Thank you to the audience for their.
It helps to have a very savvy literary audience as well. So thank you for being with us tonight. We're hosting more programs all the time. You can look at our website or join our newsletter for more. And I've also put links up for Megan's book. We hope you'll take a look if you haven't already. Congratulations, Megan. I'll lift this seltzer to you tonight.
Oh.
And we look forward to being with all of you in person sometime, again, at a public space.
We look forward to it too.
Thank you so much, everyone. And thank you. Hi, Mom and Emily. I just want to say hi.
Thanks,
and thank you, community, for being such a lifeline for all of us during this time and connecting us with books and events like this. We would be lost without you.
Well, same here.
Absolutely.
The support makes a huge difference. Thanks, everybody, and be well, and good night.
Good night.
Thank you. Good night.